Hi everyone, welcome to our webcast. I hope you've all had a fantastic start of the year and looking forward to bringing better and stronger customer success solutions in 2020. I'm very excited to be with you all again and to welcome Matt Wagner from Visible, talking about project management and customer success today. We're very fortunate to have Matt join us today. Having been in customer success for over 15 years, Matt brings a whole world of experience in both success management and professional services. For example, Matt was part of the leadership team that helped grow Fieldglass from 60 people in 2009 to be bought by SAP, but for over a billion, in 2014. He's currently the VP of Professional Services and Customer Success at Visible, an application that enables client-supplier collaboration. On a more personal note, when he's not talking customer success, Matt loves to spend time with his wife, children, and his dog, usually hiking somewhere most weekends. And if you ever want to talk snowboarding, Matt is your man. As customer success managers, I'm sure we all get in situations where our clients are eager to achieve outcomes and excited to work with us, but perhaps are lacking organizational structure or readiness to commit resources necessary to achieve their goals. In such situations, we put our project management hat on and do our best to drive success in a structured way. We could all agree that project management is a very fundamental skill for any customer success professional, but do you feel you have the knowledge and practice to be tactical and strategic at the same time? Do we spend enough time improving our project management skills, and do we go back to the basics often enough? In this webcast, Matt will give us his top tips on how to lead successful projects. Make sure you stay until the end for his templates and giveaways. This webcast is hosted by the Customer Success Network. I'm Maura Kudrujiva, your host today. I'm a member of the Customer Success Network and part of the Customer Success team at Permutive, the data management platform for publishers. As usual, we want to be as interactive as possible. Please post your questions in the Q&A box. We're going to have two pauses to answer them, one in the middle and one towards the end. We're also streaming live in our workplace community, so you'll be able to watch the webcast in future and continue the discussion there. Matt, thank you for joining us. Over to you.
All right, thank you so much, and look forward to the discussion. So a little bit of background. So I manage both the implementation teams as well as customer success. So really getting clients live and post go live success as well. So in doing that, there's a lot of tips from a project management that can parlay into customer success. So that's really the topic for today. But I really wanted to start with a question. So how many of us have been in the middle of a client initiative, project, whatever it might be, that has been chaotic? And Marek's going to put up a poll here in a minute, and we'll pause.
Okay. So we're getting plenty of answers really quickly. Over 90% of them are a yes. So over 90% of the people who are joining us today have been in the middle of a situation or initiative that seemed a little chaotic.
Sure. So not surprised by that answer to say, and I have been there as well. So normally when these cases are, it's usually some faction of project planning that might have gone awry, and particularly planning, which we'll get into in a minute. So really starts, with proper planning. So really asking the individual questions and ultimately documenting with the end client of, why are we doing these things? What are we going to do? All these different things. So from a customer success point of view, you might be asking yourself, okay, what's planning? And it's really driving towards and documenting scope and goals and governance, roles and responsibilities, and maybe even location if they're a very face-to-face oriented organization. But what you want to do is really document all these things, and we'll break down each one of them in individual slides. But usually if things are chaotic, you can't drive towards success, but it also sometimes parlays into chaotic situations as well. Some or all of these elements are probably not clear. Yeah. So starting so before I get into goals, a lot of us have probably been in a situation where a client have said, hey, you know, I like to do X and I want to do it in a month. And you're like, okay, great. And you realize, you know, how do I get to a timeline when I actually haven't done these things? So using these principles to document these things, have sign off on it, actually allows you to create milestones to come and ultimately timelines as well. So then driving into goals, you know, we all know that we need goals. You know, your managers have probably said, you know, what are the goals and objectives of whatever initiative? But do we use discipline with our clients to document them? And then ultimately, you know, a drive towards them is usually a question mark. So I've just given some examples of goals that I've seen, you know, in my experience, you know, in customer success. But obviously your business might dictate what goals and objectives you're trying to drive. So you should have those in your back pocket. But again, what you should do is really document those with the end client on a planning document, and then you know, drive towards those in the project, but then longer term measuring as well. So after 6 months, 12 months, etc., you should be able to measure those goals. So as we all know, they should be time bound and of course measurable as you can be. Again, to see the cause and effect of delivering it, and then seeing where you are against the success. So then get to scope. There's a lot of us, and I've been in this situation as well, that you get confused between what is scope and what is requirements, and you know, you jump in head first trying to solve problems versus really fully defining what the what is. So you know, what is it you're going to do with the end client? In a customer success world, it's, you know, it might be onboarding a new client. Of course, there's many flavors of different expansions that you might have. I call out new sponsorship here because when things change, it's important to sit down with new sponsors and saying, hey, this is the business problem you're trying to solve. These are the individual scopes that you're doing. Of course, getting on the same page on goals and objectives and governance, which I'll get into in a moment. Getting to steady state, that we've all likely have been in a hectic situation on a go live, and you know, hypercare is quite intense. So just the scope of getting to something that is steady and then ultimate BAU, however you define that, is a scope unto itself. And then the last piece to call out is really, you know, when an account is in a troubled situation, is what is the scope and plan to actually mitigate that? So ideally proactively, but sometimes, you know, we do have to be reactionary to you know, to right the ship for particular clients. So what the scope you're going to do, whatever that might be, and there could be obviously other examples, helps you identify, okay, what persons maybe you need, and then also ultimately what tasks you need to deliver against the goals and objectives, and then ultimately against the scope too. So that leads to the question of the who and the how. So a lot of us have heard, you know, governance, and I'll get into a little bit later. I'll share maybe what a structure might look like to give you a visual, and of course then roles and responsibilities. So in that accord, it's from a governance point of view, it's okay, who on the leadership side, on the end client, are you working with to really help drive the change, but then also the goals. What cadence might they need in meetings? Also, what are you asking them to do to answer questions, to give guidance, to clear roadblocks, all these different things. And that leads then to the resourcing needs. So what resources are needed against the particular scope, against the goals? And then are there any skills gaps? So we've probably been in a situation where your head's down in a project and you realize, actually, I need a technical expert that knows XYZ, whatever it is, right? Or I need a data expert that is XYZ. You want to define that up front, particularly on the skills that's needed. And then from a resourcing point of view, what is the time investment that's needed to make things successful as well? So I've kind of combined governance as well as roles and responsibility. A little bit later on, I'll give you kind of examples of these two. So from finalizing of planning, you want to document everything. I'll say documentation a few times just now this afternoon, and you want to get everything signed off. Ultimately, this brings clarity for what are you trying to achieve, who's going to do what, do they have capacity to do things? Of course, where does the work need to get done sometimes might be a key thing for the end client. And then again, document everything, have everything signed off. Ultimately, your planning document is a control mechanism to be proactive in managing the chaos, but then also really driving towards success is the ultimate thing as well. All right, then potential challenges. These are related to some of the things we just talked about. So when things aren't clear from the goals and objectives, you don't have those guiding principles to fall back on. And then I have been in projects, believe it or not, that have taken quite some time, and people forget what the initial goals were, so you're off track. The resourcing point of view, you've probably been involved with capacity challenges against skills challenges that might not be aligned against the scope. So what kind of resources need and how much time. And then expectation challenges. So really proper planning should help mitigate, and bring clarity to these things. And then design testing and even data collection, I would lump those a bit together because if it's not clear on who's doing what, when they need to get done, and ultimately what needs to get tested to move forward, those can cause delays as well. And then sign off. I know I talk around sign off, but give the individuals enough time to actually, with the documentation you're going to share, to actually give them time to sign off and ask questions and ultimately give them a week or two to close down those gaps. And then change, we'll get into a slide here in a moment, but understand where you are in the change spectrum of what you're bringing, and do you have the right resources from the end client and ultimately sponsorship if it's a significant portion of change that you're bringing to the end client as well. So to change, so change readiness. So in prepping for this webinar, I looked at other previous webinars, and one was Kate's back in early September, and she did a really good job of spelling out, change strategies, and also what resonated here was the readiness. And there's a little bit of overlap of her webinar as well as this one. And I thought this was critical in thinking through, if you have goals and objectives spelled out, if you have scopes defined, if you have the governance structure, you can then do a kind of a litmus test of where you are against the spectrum. So the first piece is, what change are you bringing? So it's really a litmus test of saying, okay, if you're a like for like, if you're switching out from, X tool to your tool, whatever it is, that's a like for like. So the persons are likely doing that work today, but you're changing how they do it, obviously, in your tool. Now, transformational is a little bit more change heavy. So you're changing how people might think or people behave, and then ultimately what they do. But you kind of have to do the behavioral and the thinking first of transformation. So obviously transformational is a larger chunk of work to manage change. And then you kind of have where is the initiative on the visibility scale? So of course you have the low, probably in some kind of silo or what have you, up towards the high where you have goals and objectives, well-resourced, you have governance, etc. So with these planning tools, you're ultimately trying to increase your likeliness of success. So the top line, you have success, where the bottom line, in the quadrants, you likely do not have success. So by implementing, the planning piece, you're really to drive, and do you have goals, you have scope, of course, who's aligned to who from a governance point of view, and then of course resourcing as well. So to give you as much likelihood to success as possible. And of course, where you are in the transformation, could be really dictated by your solution as well. So pause for questions right now, kind of halfway through, and we'll get into a little bit more detail in a second.
Amazing. Thank you, Matt, for a very exciting first part. As Matt mentioned, please post questions in the Q&A box. We'll ask some of them now before we move over to the next part of the presentation. And as you guys are typing, I'll just refer to one of Matt's last slides, where he mentioned another webcast that we've done in the past on change management with Kate Forgione. You'd be able to find that on our YouTube channel. So if you just type in YouTube Customer Success Network, you'll be able to see a recording of every webcast that we have done over the past year and a half. Alternatively, of course, you can also sign up to our community and see all of the recordings and the discussions that go with them over there. First question coming in from Chris Jones. Hi, Chris. Thank you for joining us. Question is, do you find reviewing customer success plans during QBRs a useful activity?
Well, it's probably a question back. That's a little bit difficult. So, yeah, usually customer success plans are aligned to, okay, what is the account plan, goals and objectives? You know, you would want those individual things in line with what you're doing for the next, 3 months, 6 months, etc. And you can layer this in with some of the planning, tools that I kind of spoke to. If your programs that you're managing don't have goals, you need to get to them as quickly as possible. And you need to get to the realization that the client might have difficulty articulating what their goals and objectives are. So as the expert in your offering and your application, whatever it is you're doing, I recommend you coming with, the goals and objectives that you guys recommend, and then even the measurable ones as well, to say, where a program is in XYZ maturity. I would recommend for the next 3 months, 6 months, etc., to tackle these goals and objectives, and here's the reason why. But get to those documented goals as quickly as possible, but realize you might have to actually bring those to the table, and clients might be challenged with bringing them. So bring that thought leadership to it as much as you can. And then if that matriculates into, hey, this is a larger project, it's an expansion, whatever it is from a scope, then, that has legs, and then you kind of put in some project management principles there too.
Amazing. And I suppose off the back of that question, we have a question from Chuck. What do you suggest if a customer's goals are more about what we want to do this year, as opposed to a long-term vision for where the program should be going?
That's not necessarily a bad thing, because again, they come to the table with, hey, I want to do, X, Y, and Z, in the next 12 months. And at that point you have the goals, and then you can kind of shape up a scope. But you can start bringing what you could possibly do in that 24-month range, because you do have to be proactive. Whatever your subscription run rate is 12 months, 24 months, 36 months. Shape up what you're trying to get to, what is the perfect client, where they sit in that spectrum, and then what goals you need to achieve in the next 12 months, to your point, but also help, give a light of the next 24 months, 36 months. You're almost proactively mitigating churn by engaging that way, and ultimately renewals.
Great. Another question coming from Grace, related to change management. How do you ensure you get executive buy-in from transformational change, specifically on inherited legacy accounts with low uptake on goals and low adoption? That's
a longer, very long conversation. The realization, I've been in situations where, working with enterprise companies, and it's the governance is great, the sponsorship's amazing, the mandate's perfect. Of course, you need to execute on it, and you have goals and objectives, and you have scope and all these different things. You still need to execute, which is still hard. But yeah, what you're asking is, how do you get the right people in the right room? How do you get the goals and objectives aligned? And how do they get energized with it? It's usually not a one person. So I've been in that situation successfully and unsuccessfully as well. And it usually takes a discerning effort from a couple different leaders, yourself, but then also maybe some other leaders within your organization to help right that ship. So to shape up what the goals and objectives are, but to get the right visibility, the right individuals, and the right backing from the end client to drive. That takes a little bit more time and effort. Yeah, and sometimes depending on your offering, if you're a transactional application and it's you need the application to keep your lights on, it's a little bit easier to mitigate. But if you're a nice to have solution, it becomes very difficult. So that might be a webinar unto itself, or a conversation over a glass of wine at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was going to say, I think we've just uncovered another webcast topic for later this year. I really liked one of the aspects that you touched on, which is related to discipline. So do we drive enough discipline with our customers? And I think this is one of the areas where customer success managers are meant to specialize the most, but also we struggle the most. How would you recommend we kind of address situations where customers maybe don't want to spend the time we want them to spend planning with us or doing the discovery, are not ready to kind of commit the time resource to get to the point where we can put a plan together?
Yeah, so we've probably all been in the situation where the client says, hey, I want to do this, I want to do it in a month, and you get really excited and you jump in head first. And usually this is where the chaos lies, after you jump in head first, right? So what this is really, it's that discipline of saying, great, we do want to actually make sure we're on the same page. What are the goals and objectives we're driving to? How do we measure those? All these different things I just said. To some clients, it might be, how do I say, it might be a bit of a challenge, or it might be a little bit of heartburn to taking 5 minutes, even 50 minutes, whatever it might be. But really come up with your own story of the why statement, of why you're doing it, and really shape that up of, hey, we're doing this to be able to measure things in 6 months, but also, making sure we're driving towards success. So however you really put it in your own words is really your why statement. And if it's a current client and you have examples of situations that you might have jumped in head first and not defined things, you can shape up, hey, we're trying to mitigate not to have that experience again. Lessons learned, we need to kind of instill this discipline. So, but there will be clients that might not enjoy spending the time on it. So you need to really shape your why statement.
Definitely. Another question that's just come through is, how can you apply project management to kind of activate passive customers? So customers who are using your solution, but keep ignoring you when you proactively contact them.
That's probably a bit like the other question around, do you have the right sponsorship, or do you have the right resources on the client side? Do they have the right motivations? So that's kind of goes back to the previous question of, that might be a webinar unto itself. But I mean, let's be honest, that's the most difficult situation, right? You have a client that, and I can name a plethora of them. You have a client that might be a huge client from an enterprise, and they're in the billions in revenue, but you've implemented a small fraction and they could use it from the enterprise, but no one knows about it, or you don't have the right people driving it on the inside. Yeah, I think that's a whole webinar unto itself, because that is a difficult thing that we have to do in our world.
Yep, it's one of the beauties of the job, I think. Fantastic. I think a lot of our questions have now started moving more towards the practical and how aspect of the topic. So I'll let you carry on, because I think a lot of them will be answered with next few slides.
Perfect. Great. All right. So if you're not a project-minded person, you might look at this and your eyeballs might roll in the back of your head, but that's not the intent. Trust me. So I wanted to kind of highlight a couple things. So typical SAS phases So I called out SaaS specifically. Most people understand what cloud is, but I do think there's still sometimes confusion on what SaaS is and what it isn't. So ultimately, there's a lot of clients out there that are used to, hey, here's my requirements, write custom code. That's actually a whole different typically offering. I'm assuming most on here are likely, a cloud offering, SaaS offering, etc. So with that, I do recommend to have phase gates in your implementation or in your project. We talked around planning and importance planning there on the left-hand side. Take these weeks as really guiding more than anything. It really depends on your offering. But really the two themes that resonate through these things are, again, document everything and sign off everything. So document the individual phases. So obviously planning, then you get into design. So you have a requirements document, maybe integration, whatever the scope might be. And then you get into sign off of that phase that enables you to create a project plan, create test scripts, identify what the change is, and then ultimately plan. And then you ultimately, you validate or you test, and then you sign off, and then you get into live, try to get to steady state again. And then I call out lessons learned, which is an important aspect, to continuously learn, like a looping learn of what went well, what didn't go well as well. So it's a lot of documents there, but then it's a lot of sign-off points. And I'm going to give you away this particular slide on some of the documents I recommend. So the first two we highlighted in the planning piece. So a planning document with sign-off on all those particular things, goals, scope, etc. And then a roles and responsibilities matrix or a Racy, and I'll give an example in the next slide. I would say embed that in your planning document. This highlights what are you going to do, why are you going to do it, how are you going to do it, and ultimately who's going to help and who's going to do it. That leads to your project plan. So depending on the size and scope and complexity, this could be, it could be short or it could be quite lengthy. For the most part, your individual company will likely have some kind of tool. If it's a large initiative, you might have subtasks, and this is where you get into task logs and RAID logs, and that might be a whole separate topic on RAID versus task, etc. from a methodology, but you'll ultimately have a plan. The design, the test plan are usually similar kind of documents to planning. Sorry, it highlights, okay, the requirements against the scope in a design doc. You want sign off on that, and then the test plan is a high level. Okay, we need these particular testers. This is what they're going to do, and then test scripts. Depending on the complexity and the client understanding of your application, it might need to be a step-by-step how-to manual to get them through A to B to C to D. Even if it's a new client, that might help. But then if it's an existing client, you're adding different steps. You might want to do the full end-to-end. But again, depending on your business, will dictate the extensiveness of it. And then a change plan. So I called out some of the key things, especially the benefits or what's in it for me. And then, training, coaching, and that reinforcement continuously of what's coming. And ideally your end client driving this from, driving this, especially the stakeholders. Go, no go, this says, hey, we're going from a test environment to production, and we've tested everything, we're good to go. It's usually a very, very straightforward matrix with all the individual decision makers and essentially a yes, no. And then lessons learned, I alluded to, this should be a meeting, ideally, with the client. And you should really have a warts and all conversation of what went well, what didn't go well. And don't focus on the blame game, but really use it as an opportunity to get better. Because if you're driving to success, you have those goals and objectives, you have the right governance, things are going to go awry in a project, and that's okay. But how do you learn from it to ultimately get the next expansion and think of longer term renewals, etc. So really use those lessons learned as an important checkpoint. All right, so the next two slides, I really wanted to highlight a Racy matrix because this might be confusing to some. So Racy is really, it highlights who's responsible, who's the approver on certain things, who might be a supporter or consultant, and then who might just be informed on particular items as well. Some people do choose to get rid of that consultant item, and that's okay. They just feel it might be redundant to the supporter, and that's completely fine. In this example, these are really work stream leads. So if you think, okay, who's going to be the PM, who's going to be the program office, training, etc. So you have a high level, and then I always like to put who's going to be the lead on the particular work stream. This usually results, and this will be a takeaway on a lengthy or detailed Racy matrix if it's a complex or detailed implementation that you're managing. But even if it's not, I do recommend to have the major items, and we'll share some templates on it as well, just like the planning doc. And then governance. You've heard around governance. What's governance? Everyone screams about governance, and essentially it's the structure of and cadence and really what you're asking individuals to do at certain levels. So this is a 4 level. You can have 3 or 2. It just really, again, it depends on your organization, who you're working with on the end client. But it aligns, who's aligned to who on your side as well as the client side. Maybe there's a partner involved in here as well. At the project level, maybe at the program level on up, okay? And then on the right-hand side, I've just given some examples of when they might meet, as well as what are you asking them to do and even maybe decide upon. So if there's maybe a change, you have to go up, should the change be affected, that might open planning up again, et cetera, et cetera. So you're asking different levels to do certain things. So spell that out up front. And you can use this as a guide. You'll have this as a takeaway as well. All right, so in summary of really the whole session, utilize proper planning. Usually when individuals come to me and they're in a chaotic situation, I usually ask, how are we on planning? Or has something changed after planning? And usually the answer, yeah, we probably know the answer, right? And this is where documentation as well as getting sign off comes in. So don't think of it as a negative. It's really to say, okay, do we have a snapshot along the way of the project to ultimately align towards success? Because our ultimate goal is to say, how do we get clients on a journey and a path to success using your solution, whatever it might be. And you really want to document that and see where they are over time and see what that journey is, and you can kind of map that out. And then the last takeaway is, look, change requests are going to come, and really utilizing some of these tools will help kind of manage that change a little bit more effectively, or more appropriately, maybe is the better word. That's really all for today. So we open up really for last questions.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Matt. I think that was what I liked about it. Like, it sounds like it's not that difficult to implement, regardless of what kind of our technology is offering and what change we're trying to drive. At the end of the day, it's all about just defining the right goals and being disciplined. Customer success managers and onboarding specialists tend to be very disciplined people. So it's all about giving that discipline away to some of our customers as well.
That's right.
A few questions. So you mentioned a couple of times that things will go not necessarily as you've planned them sometimes, and that's all right. But when we are in the middle of the project, before it's ended, and things do go wrong, how do we plan? What is the best way to plan for escalations, and how do we handle that in the most productive way?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the first off, if the assumption is you have proper planning, you have documentation, you have those goals, you have who is aligned to who, right? And let's just say something goes awry, you might add, change of scope, and maybe at the project level, they're not agreeing that it's a change in scope, but it might be, there's so many scenarios about that, right? This is where you need to lean on the sponsors on your side to have conversations with the end client. More than likely, if not all the time, but a lot of times, if things are awry, it might be needed that you go back into planning. So it doesn't mean the whole initiative is on hold, but something fundamental has really, really changed. Maybe it's a resource, maybe it's not clear on who does what. Again, skill gap, whatever it might be. And then skill gap could be on your side as well, to be clear. And so something is awry, which tells me probably planning wasn't really fully complete, or you need to open it up again. Yeah, so I would lean on your individual sponsor to have the right conversations, and that's what those guys and gals are there for.
Thank you. A question coming from Veronica. How do you make sure when introducing this whole process that people don't get overwhelmed with the many steps and bits that are necessary in order to get the final sign-off?
Third rail. So I think that, again, you need to shape up what your why statement is. So this is harder to retrofit into an existing client that may not be completely chaotic, but they're not used to this kind of discipline. So you really need to shape up your why of it. So why are you going to these kind of steps? And but ultimately the answer typically is to create a higher level of percentage of success, is really what you're trying to do. But you need to put it in your own words, and you need to sell it, right? But again, retrofitting this kind of discipline into an existing client that might maybe, again, not chaotic, but may not be used to it, is more difficult than a new client. So shape up your why.
Yeah. Would you also touch on, I suppose, those expectations being set earlier in the process? Customers coming to us already knowing what are the ways in which we work and what resources would be expecting?
100%. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, if you don't have this kind of methodology from an onboarding, it doesn't have to be exactly like this, to be clear, but you ultimately need from sales alignment as well. So you need to know, hey, I'm going to ask you what the goals are, during the sales process. Likely, why did they buy? Who are we going to work with? So governance structure, from who's going to sponsor, all these different things. And what are we trying to deliver to? So if you don't have that from a net new client, I would start instilling it there. And then how do you then retrofit it into the existing client base? Again, it might be a little bit tricky depending on the client. But discipline and documentation and sign off goes a long way. For
sure. We have one question around how you kind of work with your team to achieve that those outcomes. When you templatized to document all of this, when you created those templates, did you distribute them to the whole CS team, or do you use a centralized storage like a wiki or a CRM tool, or what's the best way to kind of make sure the team sticks to what's out there in terms of project management purposes?
Yeah, so my days, there's probably a two-part answer. So if you're with a larger organization, my days at SAP and SAP Fieldglass, and when we were smaller, Fieldglass, we grew, globally. This is why I'm over here in the UK. So it was a little bit, we had kind of SharePoint and things like this. We had templates that were global, but then we regionalized them as well. So our offering was very specific to country regulations. So Fieldglass manages external labor, okay? Whereas where I'm at now, it's quite universal, at least as we see now. So we didn't have to kind of create sub-bullets of particular countries and things like this. So it's a bit of a two-part answer to your question. It really depends on what your offering is, and do you have to get specific to certain scope, location, line of business, industry, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Another question related to how we put that in practice. Would you modify that way of project management depending on the customer tier? For example, with enterprise customers, it's obvious that we need to be very vigilant with project management, but with smaller customers, would we select some aspects of that and capitalize on them, or would we just copy the process?
So we're going through that right now. So those clients who are important, every client is important, but maybe not as hands-on as the larger clients, right? I think that's the question, really. So the answer is no. You're probably not going to spend as much time, usually with those, say, digital accounts or however you kind of categorize them from a tier. How do you get their speed to value quickly and then still maybe have some of these disciplines of goals and things like this, but you're likely not to have expansive, governance structures or even meetings, right? So that's a whole, how do you get speed to value with more efficiently, which usually matriculates into less effort, but they still get that value. So with sales, I recommend actually still capturing that data, but you're not investing as much time in those type of accounts as an enterprise account.
I think this is also always one of the trickiest parts of customer success management. At the customer success network, every time we open the question of what do you guys want to know more about, everyone goes scaling. How do I take my process and how do I scale it? And
yeah, I mean the SMB or the small to medium business, if you didn't know what the SMB is, you can usually shape that up. It's usually the clients that should be enterprise and using your application way more, and they're in that middle tier, but how much time do I really spend versus not, and are they really going to transform or change? That's usually the gray spot that's a little bit more difficult. And for years, we got it right sometimes and we got it wrong. Yeah.
As anything. Another question coming in. Are you involved in the pre-sales meetings in order to introduce the process early and to build relationships with key stakeholders to get better buy-in?
Yeah, ideally, yes, especially on those larger accounts. And then also really collaboration with sales, because you're not going to be able to be in every meeting, every room. You can only scale to a certain amount of meetings. And hopefully if your sales is doing well, then the volume of their meetings goes up, and that's a good sign, right? So there's a couple different things. Obviously, spend the right people shaping up what the vision needs to be, probably on those larger accounts, but also getting in line with kind of the why statements of why you're asking this from the sales point of view and their transition as well. So ultimately, we're trying to deliver success, whatever your success items pillars are, to get adoption at the end client, measure that adoption, whatever those measuring pillars are, and then seeing where you can actually scale things up at the end client, and that'll drive to renewals. If you shape that up in that story with the sales individual, they'll understand it. And most sales individuals, not all, but some are depending on the organization, are comped on renewals as well. So it's in their best interest to make sure that the solution is sticky, so if you shape up the why you're asking the questions, I think it'll resonate more.
For sure. Another question, would you hire someone specifically to run project management? For example, in some companies we have engagement managers, and if so, at what point of the company maturity would you move over to doing that?
It really depends on your solution. So at Fieldglass, our offering was extremely complex. So it's procure to pay and external labor. So we had an implementation team and a clear handoff with what we called account services, which is probably more traditional customer success. And then there might be a loop where implementation might get involved, but half of that implementation team are project managers. But does every individual offering need a full project manager, project management team? It's really dependent on your offering. It depends usually on how complex things are. That usually equates to all the moving parts, of course, of a scope. And then it usually then matriculates into a time quotient as well. So it really depends on your business.
Absolutely. Matt, thank you so much. I think we've managed to ask all the questions that were posted. Thank you, everybody, for posting those questions. Yeah, I think this is it from us from today. A couple of things to note. we'll be posting Matt's slides on the workplace community that we have. Similarly, the templates that he will be giving out will be posted there as well. In the webcast group, do join us. customersuccess.network is where you can submit your name and email to be added to our community. As always, we're providing this as an open community for all customer success professionals that are looking for help. We organize webcasts like this every month, so do please join us for our next session in March and continue driving the discussion on our community. Thank you very much to everyone who joined us. To Matt, have a fantastic afternoon.
Thank you.